The house stood like a fortress on the hill, its marble columns gleaming under the golden morning sun. From the outside, it looked like a symbol of perfection, wealth, success, and stability. Inside, however, lay a test no one had spoken of, a silent challenge set by the man who owned it, Jonathan Claiborne. A man whose net worth was whispered about in financial circles, was known for his sharp mind and unshakable business instincts. But that morning, his curiosity wasn't about stocks or mergers, it was about trust. In the library at the far end of the East Wing, there stood a safe. It wasn't hidden behind a painting or disguised as furniture. It was bold, visible, a statement. Inside was a collection of cash bundles, gold coins, and rare jewelry worth more than most families made in a lifetime. That morning, Jonathan did something no one expected. He left the safe open. It wasn't an accident. The door stood ajar by design, the lock disengaged, the treasures inside glimmering in the soft light spilling through the tall windows. Jonathan didn't call his lawyers or his security team. He didn't tell anyone. Instead, he poured himself a cup of coffee, sat in his leather chair, and waited. The person he was waiting for was Grace Turner, his housemaid of 7 years. Grace was in her late 40s, with hands worn from decades of work and eyes that carried stories of both struggle and resilience. She was a black woman who had lived through enough to understand the unspoken rules of the world, especially in a town where her skin color still made her invisible to some and too visible to others. Grace arrived at work the same way she always did, quietly, without fuss, wearing her neatly pressed uniform. She greeted Jonathan politely as she did every morning, then headed toward the East Wing to start her routine. She had no idea that today, her actions were being watched more closely than ever. Jonathan sipped his coffee, watching her through the barely open library door. She entered with her cleaning supplies, humming softly under her breath. Grace was thorough, she always was, dusting the heavy bookshelves, straightening the leather-bound volumes, wiping down the polished surfaces. Then she saw it. The safe. Her eyes paused for just a moment. She wasn't a fool. She knew exactly what it was worth. She also knew it was open, wide open. The velvet-lined trays inside were filled with gold watches, pearl necklaces, thick rolls of $100 bills. Anyone else might have felt their pulse quicken. Their mind wandered to impossible what-ifs. But Grace didn't move closer. She didn't touch a thing. She simply shook her head with a faint, almost sad smile and went back to dusting. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, studying her face. That look, half amusement, half resignation, caught his attention. It wasn't the reaction of someone tempted. It was the reaction of someone who had seen too much of life to be swayed by shiny things. A few minutes later, Grace finished in the library, carefully shutting the safe door, not locking it, just closing it before moving on to the next room. Jonathan set down his coffee, his mind restless. Why hadn't she even looked? Why hadn't she hesitated even for a moment? Later that day, as Grace was polishing the silver in the dining room, Jonathan approached her. "Grace," he said casually, "did you notice anything unusual in the library this morning?" She looked up from her work, her expression calm. "Yes, sir. Your safe was open." He waited for her to continue, but she didn't. "And?" he prompted. "And," she said, "I figured it wasn't my business. My job is to clean, not to touch what doesn't belong to me." Her words were simple, but there was a firmness in them that stopped him. Jonathan tilted his head. "You weren't tempted?" Grace set down the polishing cloth and met his gaze directly. Her voice was steady. "Mr. Claiborne, temptation isn't in the things you see. It's in the kind of person you decide to be. I've lived too long, worked too hard, to let a handful of money decide my character. Besides," she allowed herself a small smile, "you'd have missed that cash long before I could have enjoyed it." Jonathan chuckled, but there was something in her tone that unsettled him. It wasn't just honesty, it was dignity. Still curious, he asked, "Have you ever been accused of taking something, even when you didn't?" Her smile faded. She took a slow breath before answering, "Yes, more than once. And not because I did anything wrong, because of who I am. When you're a black woman working in someone else's home, people will see what they want to see. If something's missing, you're guilty first, innocent later, if ever." The silence that followed was heavy. Jonathan had never thought about it that way. He had never lived with the weight of being prejudged. Every time he walked into a room, Grace returned to her polishing, her movements calm. But Jonathan could see there was more to the story. Something in her eyes told him, She wasn't just talking about petty accusations. She was talking about years of carrying suspicion like a shadow. Later that evening, Jonathan sat in his study, replaying the moment in his head. He realized the test he thought he was conducting had been something entirely different. It wasn't about whether Grace would steal. It was about whether he truly understood the silent burdens she carried. But he wasn't ready to let it go. The next morning, he decided to press further. When Grace arrived, he greeted her with a warm smile and invited her to sit down for coffee, a gesture that surprised her. She hesitated, then took a seat across from him at the polished oak table. "I owe you an explanation," Jonathan began. "I left that safe open on purpose." Grace raised her eyebrows slightly but said nothing. "I wanted to see. I don't know if you could be tempted." Her lips curved into a wry smile. "And what did you learn?" "That I had it all wrong," he admitted. "I thought it was about trust. But now I think it's about respect." Grace tilted her head. "Respect?" "Yes," he said slowly. "I respected your work, your consistency, but I never thought about what it means to respect your life, your history, the things you've been through. I see you here every day, but I don't think I ever really saw you." Grace looked at him for a long moment, then spoke softly. "Most people don't, that's why it doesn't surprise me when someone tries to test me. I've been tested all my life. Every job, every room I've walked into, someone's always waiting for me to prove I'm not what they think I am." Jonathan felt a knot in his throat. He had set a trap, thinking it was harmless curiosity, but what he had really done was reopen a wound Grace had learned to live with. Before Grace could stand to leave, he asked her to tell him more about her life, her experiences, the things she had faced, and for the first time in 7 years she did. She told him about the first job she had as a teenager, cleaning offices downtown, where the manager misplaced cash from the petty drawer and accused her in front of everyone, how she was fired without pay, and how the accusation followed her when she tried to find new work. She told him about the grocery store, where she was followed by security every time she shopped, the neighbor who once called the police because she was walking too slowly in a wealthy neighborhood, the countless times people assumed she was dishonest before she even spoke. Jonathan listened in silence. Every story chipped away at the comfortable image he had of the world. He realized that while his wealth had protected him from suspicion, Grace's skin color had made her a target for it. When she finished, she stood up, ready to get back to her duties. But before she left, she said something that stayed with him. "Mr. Claiborne, trust isn't proven in the absence of opportunity. It's proven when the world expects you to fail, and you choose not to." Jonathan watched her walk away, the weight of her words settling heavily on his mind. That night, Jonathan couldn't sleep. He sat in his dimly lit study long after the house had grown quiet, staring at the closed safe in the corner. For years, he had thought of it as a symbol of security, his own personal fortress. Now it felt like a reminder of something far more fragile: the trust between human beings, and how easily it could be damaged by suspicion. Grace's words echoed in his mind. Trust isn't proven in the absence of opportunity. It's proven when the world expects you to fail and you choose not to. He thought about how many times he had been given the benefit of the doubt in life, how many mistakes he had made that were forgiven, how many chances he had been given simply because people assumed he was the kind of man who deserved them. And then he thought of Grace, who had never been afforded that luxury. The next morning, Jonathan made a decision. Not a token gesture, not a polite thank you, but something that would truly acknowledge what Grace had taught him. When she arrived, he greeted her not in his usual distracted tone, but with a deliberate warmth. "Grace," he said, "can you join me in the library for a moment?" She hesitated. She could tell something was different, but followed him. The safe was open again, but this time it didn't hold gold coins or jewelry. Instead, inside lay a thick envelope and a neatly folded letter. Jonathan motioned for her to take it. "Go on," he said. Grace picked up the envelope, feeling its weight. She opened it and saw a cashier's check, an amount so large it made her blink twice. "Mr. Claiborne, I can't," she began, but he raised his hand. "Please, let me explain." He gestured for her to sit. "What I did the other day wasn't just a test, it was a reflection of my ignorance. I've lived in a world where trust is a currency I've never had to fight for. You've lived in a world where you've had to earn it 1,000 times over, without ever being given it freely. That's not right, and I can't change the world overnight. But I can change how I see you, how I honor you. Grace's eyes softened, but her posture stayed composed. Sir, I appreciate the thought, but I didn't do anything special. I just did my job. Jonathan shook his head. No, Grace, you didn't just do your job. You carried dignity into a situation designed to rob you of it. You taught me something. I should have understood long ago that character isn't proven in wealth or status, but in the choices we make when no one is watching. Except in this case I was. Grace looked down at the check again, still unsure. What do you expect me to do with this? Anything you want, he said simply. Start a business. Buy a home. Take a trip. Consider it an investment in someone whose integrity is worth more than all the gold in that safe. For the first time in a long while, Grace's voice faltered. You know, I've worked in this house for 7 years, and not once did I think you saw me as more than the help. But today, maybe that's changing. Jonathan smiled faintly. It is. And I want to do more than just change my own perspective. I want to share it. He explained that he had been thinking about hosting an annual scholarship in Grace's name for young people from underrepresented communities who wanted to pursue careers in business, hospitality, or any field they chose. It won't erase the injustices, he said, but maybe it will open a few doors. Grace was quiet for a long moment. Mr. Claiborne, I've spent my whole life trying to keep doors from being shut in my face. If you can open a few for someone else, then maybe this conversation wasn't for nothing. The weeks that followed brought a shift in the Claiborne household. Jonathan began taking more time to speak with the staff, to learn about their lives beyond their work. Grace noticed the difference not just in him, but in how the other employees carried themselves when they realized their stories mattered too. One afternoon, while arranging fresh flowers in the dining room, Grace overheard Jonathan speaking with a group of guests. They were curious about the new scholarship fund, and Jonathan told them the truth, not the polished, press-ready version, but the real story. He told them about the day he left his safe open, the woman who passed the test without even thinking about it, and how it forced him to confront his own blind spots. She didn't need to prove herself to me, he said to the guests. I needed to prove I was worthy of her trust. Months later, at the first scholarship award ceremony, Jonathan insisted Grace be on stage beside him. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes, and when Jonathan spoke, he introduced her not as his maid, but as the woman who reminded me that integrity is the greatest form of wealth. Grace spoke too, her voice steady before the crowd. This scholarship isn't about me. It's about all the people who've been judged before they've been known. It's about the ones who've been tested in ways they never asked for. If this helps even one young person be seen for their potential instead of their circumstances, then it's worth more than any check in the world. The applause that followed was long and heartfelt. That night, after the guests had gone and the lights in the ballroom had dimmed, Grace walked past the library. The safe was there, closed and locked. She smiled faintly to herself, not because of the money inside, but because she knew that, for once, the richest thing in that room wasn't behind steel walls. It was the respect she had earned, and the change she had sparked in a man who thought he was testing her, but ended up testing himself. And as she turned off the light, she whispered words that only the quiet room could hear. Sometimes, the greatest treasure is knowing who you are, no matter who's watching.